everyone, welcome to our podcast, Behind the Mystery. And today we're going to talk about the historical backdrop of the fourth book in the Ginger Gold Mystery series called Murder at Feathers and Flair. And so this will be a fun one to talk about fashion and also women in business and other sort of trivia that was taking place in the backdrop of this book historically. So the unique thing about the fashions of the 1920s was I think it was a statement against, all of the sort of oppression and repression of, is repression a word?
Depression is a word,
Not
yeah.
depression, repression.
Repression, that's a word too, yeah, as far as I know.
Being repressed.
You can be depressed and repressed. There can be oppression too.
Oppression. So there was a reaction to the fashions of the Victorian era. So, in the Victorian era, there were the tight corsets, lots of fabric that inhibited movement, the high collars buttoned up, the long hair that needed to be managed and put up in a knot, tied up, laced up boots. I mean, getting dressed in the Victorian era was a real ordeal. And then, just having to do just basic practical stuff from day to day. So when the war came along and women, were able to ditch all of that and had to, in order to help out with the war effort, they certainly didn't want to go back to that after. And so we saw a real pendulum swing. We saw the hair get cut off really short, no corsets, and straight lines in the dresses, so no tight waists. The hemlines came up, and instead of the boots, they're wearing the T-strap shoes, which were very iconic for that time. And so it made women feel loose. The fabrics were lighter. They just felt this liberation from the restraints of Victorian society. And this sort of bleeds over into the workforce as well, which we'll talk about. But what sometimes I get questions about the fashions, because I am quite detailed in my writing when it comes to what my characters wear, because I feel like that's one of the reasons why they are reading this book. Readers want to be immersed into the world of this fashion and the energy of the Jazz and Golden Age. And so, of course, I had access to the internet, but I also, for those who are watching on YouTube, I made big use. I made a lot of usage out of this book. You can see how massive it is. It's got a spine that's about 1.5 inches deep. 1920s Fashion, the Definitive Source Book, edited by Charlotte Fiel and Emmanuel Durex. And it's just this lovely book of fashion throughout the 20s. And so it didn't go in chronological order, though, the images. So I would have to go year by year. I would flip through this book and I'd say, okay, I'm in 1924. And I'd go through, and you can see I would label with these little tags every year. I can see the last year here is 29 because that's the year I'm on right now. And so then I would look at the book and I would say, oh, I think I'm picturing her wearing this. And I would try and describe that outfit just to try and become a little bit more authentic and accurate. I also had another book which was from B. Altman's and Company, which is basically their catalog of the day in England, and flips through that and say, oh, what were women looking at the catalog? What kind of fashions were they seeing? And I would find my year and my season, and I would look at that and say, oh, this is what my character is wearing. So that's how I approached it initially. After a while, I just became very well versed on the fashions and the styles, but I still I would still refer back to these books, and also to I would just Google it as well, what the fashions were of the day.
Well, I did some Googling for men's fashions.
Yes, because it wasn't just the women who had extraordinary fashion of the time.
Yes. And obviously, I'm very well known to be to have very avant-garde, impeccable fashion sense. Not. But I thought, well, what did the men wear back then? And so I looked it up. And so one of the things that's very different than today is that everybody wore a hat. Men always wore a hat.
Yeah, that lasted for decades, actually,
Yeah.
right up until the end of the 1950s.
And in the 1920s, especially the early 1920s, there were three hats. There was something called the Homburg, with the dent in the crown and a stiff upturned brim. And then there was the bowler or coke hat, they used to call it. Don't know why they call it a coke hat. And then the trilby was similar to the Homburg, which I know that Basil wore the trilby a lot. And they were starting to in 1923, 1924.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about right now, early 1924?
Yeah, January 1924 is the setting for this book, Murder at Feathers and Flair.
Yeah, so that was gaining ground back then. And then men wore suits. They were a little bit softer in their silhouette than in the previous era. They had hand-painted ties were very popular with Art Deco, geometric patterns, Oxford shoes, pocket watches, and many men had a cane. Not because of that they needed one. It was just considered part of it was a mark of elegance to have a cane. So that's very different.
Yeah, different than now. Yeah. Well, we certainly couldn't be walking around with a cane these days. We move so fast, I think. Society just moves so fast, it feels like. Yeah, and other, things that I had to research for this book were, the famous fashion designers of the time, which I mentioned throughout the early books in the series, and I often tried to bring in real-life fashion designers into the storyline when I could. And one fun one that I did, I don't think it was in this book, but was Coco Chanel. She's the most famous fashion designer of this era. And in fact, when I was looking, her perfume, Chanel No. 5, actually was launched in 1921. That's how old that sort of perfume line is. And it was very popular by 1924. It had really gained some ground. And actually, this is a good segue to women in business because, Coco Chanel, she obviously made a big name for herself and a mark in the world in the area of a woman in business. And in those days, there were more women in business than ever before, again, largely because of the war and women having to coming out of more traditional roles and into the workforce. But they did end up settling in areas that were more like fashion, hospitality, publishing, those kind of little more, I guess, softer trades. But at least they were able to kind of get in there and work and be entrepreneurs if they wanted to, and like people like Ginger really wanted to. Although they did, have a higher standard that they had to live up to in society, morally and whatever, because their reputations could easily be ruined. And then that would ruin their business prospects too. And so in Murder and Feathers and Flair, there's actually a murder that happens in her shop, which would have been extraordinarily scandalous. I don't know if I actually wrote that in well enough, but if that had happened in real life, I think that would have been enough to shut that business down for good, unfortunately.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. So,
we should talk about this was, we mentioned already, this was the early 1924. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about what's happening in London at the time.
Yeah.
The historical kind of
That's
context.
a good idea, yeah.
So I looked it up, and there was a couple of very interesting things happen. The one that was grabbing the most headlines in early January of that year was the first Labour government. The first ever Labour government.
Politics, yeah.
Led by Ramsay MacDonald.
Politics is always a big subject, no matter the era, seems like, yeah.
So the headlines were a mix of hope from the left and dire warnings from the right. And the Daily Mail was particularly harsh on the new first Labour government. And in culture, in the cinema, Hollywood dominated at that time. British cinema was kind of at a silent phase, or a low phase, I would call it.
I think Hollywood, that was sort of when, things were just getting established. Like studios were just becoming built, and big names were just starting to, hit the headlines.
Well, the blockbuster.
Yes.
And in 1923, end of 1923 into 1924, if you would have gone to the cinema in London, the movie you would have probably seen or heard the most of was the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, which I, this morning, took a little on YouTube. You can go and actually watch the movie in full. This is a really interesting experience, the Ten Commandments. And then another one was The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring Lon Chaney. So this was also towards the end of 1923, I think. So that's what have been playing in the theaters. We've mentioned this, I think, in previous podcasts, but the electric tram network was just starting to come into use. Motor buses were replacing horse-drawn. The private motor car was still a luxury item back then. The BBC, which was started in 1922, by 1923, early 1924, it was now becoming not as commonplace, but you could now listen to a news report in your own home.
Yes, we take a lot for granted nowadays, but back then it was just a big deal to hear somebody broadcast the news in your own home, and families would sit around the radio and listen.
That's right. So in that era, it was just starting to happen. Unemployment remained high. Stories in the newspaper about housing shortages, labor disputes, and veteran struggles. So that's kind of the bit of the historical stuff that was going on when this murder took place in Feathers and Flair.
Yeah, and that makes me think about, the 1920s are typically remembered as a decade of abundance. Lots of money. The stock market was doing really well. But I think what we see and hear a lot about that actually takes place in America. I mean, there was wealth and abundance in some neighborhoods in England too, but just like after the Second World War, after the First World War, the recovery in Europe took longer because there wasn't really the war didn't happen in North America. So people were able to pick up their lives and move on a lot more quickly than they were able to, I think, in England and Europe. And so we don't feel it as much there, like what you're talking about, the politics and people having unemployment and unrest. I think that was more prevalent, at least in the early 20s in England than, say, in the US. And then the wealth that came with the stock market started to dribble over across the Atlantic. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, but that's my impression.
Another thing I thought was interesting is in this book that Ginger's new car is introduced.
Yes.
So she bought a 1924 Crosley Sports Tourer.
Yes, because she was in a car accident. And she had been driving a 1913 Daimler is what I had written in there. Honestly, I can't remember if that was Ambrosia's car brought to Hartigan House, or if it was Mr. Hartigan, her father, who had left it there. But that was pretty much the only type of car from the 1913 eras that was available anyways. There wasn't a lot to choose from. But by the 1920s, a decade later, things were changing that way. So when Ginger totaled her car, she was in the market for a new one.
And the dominant car, I think, was probably the Model T. Ginger's choice of the Crossley is interesting because it's a sports tourer. It was more of an expensive car back then. So I thought, well, what would it be like to drive one of those things? And for one thing, when you got in the car and started it, the key didn't operate the ignition like we know today. It was a button that you push. So you've had to first manually adjust something called spark advance and fuel mixture. There were levers for this, and you had to get it just right or they would backfire. Most people still had to crank their cars, which was a dangerous thing to do because if it backfired, it could break your arm or break your wrist. People had broken thumbs from it. And we couldn't picture Ginger doing something like that at that time. So we...
Not if she didn't have to.
Yeah, not if she didn't have to. So she opted to get the very expensive option of having a switch that would actually turn the engine over. And I looked it up how much that would cost to have that extra button put in to start the car and not have to use the crank. And it was something like, I don't have it written down here, but it was something like a third of a year's wage for the average worker, just for that extra option of that button.
Yes. See, cars were a real novelty item, and like a lot of things, those who have resources are able to try the new things first when they come out and are really expensive. I mean, when I wrote in the Crossley, it was more like, I want to look for a cool car that was made in Europe that could have been Ginger's, and isn't this a pretty one? And I don't know that at least not consciously, I was not aware exactly how it operated, and I definitely didn't know about this expensive upgrade, but it would make sense that Ginger would have had the upgrade, and because I never wrote about her having to crank her car. And when you see pictures of the Crossley, the 1924 Crossley, it is a lovely vehicle. Maybe we can do a little image on the screen about it. But sure. It's, it was pearly white on the exterior. It had like the what do you call it, the spikes, the spokes in the wheels, narrow wheels with the black and white. And the nice red leather interior with the glossy wood dashboard and
top speed of 65 miles an hour, which was very fast.
She would have loved that. She would have loved that.
We've mentioned Ginger's driving peculiarities before in the podcast.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense now to think of why Ginger would not be self-aware when it came to her driving habits, because she's obviously very intelligent. But you were telling me when we were talking about the cars back in those days that they were actually very rough to operate and difficult, and we didn't have power steering or power anything, so you really had to work and crank, and you didn't feel there was no shock absorbency.
Well, not like we have today. So it very much, I have never driven one of these. I would sure love to. But to have that experience, but it was a rough ride compared to what we know today. Even though the Crossley had an advanced suspension system for the time, but it was every move of the wheel. You had to be at constant attention to the wheel because the slightest movement would turn the wheel. And it was a feeling of like we're used to being like a cockpit. You're nestled in the car, but back in those days it was more, especially with the Crossley, which was, it had it was, what do you call it? It could be either in or outside.
Was with the roof going down, you mean?
Yeah.
Convertible?
Convertible. And so with the Crossley, it was, you didn't feel, with all the cars back then, it more felt like you were riding on top of something, on top of this mechanized chassis. We're used to feeling like we're in a cockpit and nestled in the car. In those days, it was more like you're riding on top of this beast that you had to somehow control.
Yeah.
And the Crosley was one of the first cars, I think, to have brakes on all four wheels too. So the braking was better than it was on a normal car. But even then, you still had to plan in advance your braking. So you see how it might have been a little crazy driving with Ginger.
Yes, and if she's distracted and preoccupied by all the things that she's thinking about all at once, all the time, then it sort of can make sense that she would have these erratic driving habits.
Yeah. So this is the book, Feathers and Flair. It just caught my attention that this was the book that we often refer back to the car throughout the rest of the books. So.
Yes. I'm not absolutely sure that we mentioned this car in Feathers and Flair. I know she loses the other car.
Oh.
But just in case we're wrong about that, because, we're doing these every week and I don't reread the entire book when we come to these podcasts. I review them. And so I did learn about, I remembered the wreck and the Daimler, but I don't recall so just in case. But for sure by the next book, which is Murder at the Mortuary. So we hope that you're enjoying these podcasts and these little bit of historical backdrops to the books and just the historical trivia. And if you are, please like our videos and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And on the next one will be an interesting topic because it's Murder in the Mortuary, and so it will be about early forensics, and which I always find really fascinating. So I hope that you will join us for that then. So, is there anything else you want to say?
I think that covers it.
That covers it. Okay. Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm Lee Strauss. This is my host, Norm Strauss. I probably forgot to mention that at the beginning of this episode. But thank you for joining us at Behind the Mystery, and we hope to see you next time.